there were a few things I noticed during, again, I'm teaching Reconstruction uh, this semester. And let me make sure this camera is good. All right. Um, this was a good week. The spring semester just started. And I'm um, I'm noticing some things and I'm getting some very good questions in the classes that I wanted to kind of make sure got brought online as well in case, because some of these things are just things that people are not thinking about. All right, we're covering Reconstruction, which is the period directly after the Civil War. Generally, obviously, the Civil War ended in 1865. The technical years of the United States Civil War is 1861 to 1865. And Reconstruction is counted generally starting before the end of the war, and people count it all the way back to either the effectuation of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 or the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which is as early as September of 1862, all the way until 1877, which is when the Northern military was pulled from occupying the South to make sure that the reconstructive amendments were taking place. It was kind of the penal period or the adjustment period until the Northern whites were forced to let the Southern white brethren into the Union. And I think it was more so because of the financial component for commerce to really maximize as to where they could not allow these wealthy Southerners to. There's only so long they were going to be able to let these wealthy Southerners not have a say in the government. It was just too much Southern power. I believe that's about how long it took for the Southern products to ramp back up globally, which is about 10 years, and becoming economic powers to where they could not keep them suppressed anymore. And obviously, the antebellum period is period early 1800s all the way up to 1860. That's before the war, all the stuff that happened that caused the war. So you have to understand the Civil War didn't just pop out of nowhere. It was when they formed the Union, they really didn't have the plan that they needed that ultimately became the successful plan of the United States. So 1776, they declare their independence. And through the 1790s, because at first they had Articles of Confederation. And that just pretty much got them through the war. That was who are we and what are we trying to do? But most of all, it didn't tell them how to regulate taxes to pay for the things that the nation needed. So as opposed to fixing the Articles of Incorporation, they just went on and made a constitution. And then they made a constitution, but it was centralized around the government and really hadn't taken into consideration the citizens or the states. So this when you came up with your amendments. And so now you have all of these different amendments that are bestowing the rights and privileges on whom is supposed to get it. And that takes us into the late 1790s. But now in the late 1790s, now we know what kind of government we're going to have, who gets to participate. And that's when you start seeing the removal of people, the removal of the Native American, the removal of black people. They're trying to ship black people back to Africa. Um, they're trying, especially free black people. The black people that's owned by white people were fine. They're removing Mexican people. The Mexican American War, all of that was a taking Texas all the way to California, all the way up to Idaho. All of that was Texas. So you have all these things going on, and we're still moving forward into the 1800s. And the economies have not settled. You still have one economy forming in the South. You have an industrial economy forming in New England. You have commercial farming in the Midwest. And then you have this taking of Mexican land in the West. And this was something that came up. Why did the American white men implode during this period? Why in the mid 19th century did they implode? Well, up until this time, there was always more land to take from somebody. Yeah, you got it. Okay, fine. You take that. We'll go. Well, it was always more land to take from the Native Americans. It was always more land to take from the French. It was always more land to take from Mexico. Well, after the Mexican American War, they hit pay dirt. That's it. There's no more land to take. We hit water. So now we got to fight over how this is going to go. It was always, oh, okay, fine. You got that. I'll go take this. Okay, you take that. Okay, we'll take this. Well, now they've hit the end of the continent. And that's when the rubber met the proverbial road. And that's why war broke out, because there was no more room to grow. There was nothing else to take. Decisions had to be made. And this bloody war happens. And when we talk about Reconstruction, even though we don't talk about Reconstruction correctly, where we're talking about this redemptive period of whites and America as a nation redeeming itself and correcting its greatest evil, which is questionable because the genocide of Native Americans is probably the greatest evil. But this greatest evil of slavery, that's what is being talked about during Reconstruction. But are we asking the proper questions? Half of our population are women. Women did not get to vote until 18, no, until, well, white women got to vote during the 1920s. Even though they collected the support of black women from the previous 100 years, Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and so on. When white women got the right to vote in 1920, they spent the next 45 years fighting against black women getting the right to vote. That's why the feminist movement, there's a lot more history there than just female empowerment, especially with black women. They really need to have an acute understanding of how this feminist movement functioned off the backs of black women, yet did not have their interest at heart. Um, but as far as the point of Reconstruction, we talk about black folks big time, though it is not accurately represented. It is taught as this period of progress, but it's still more like Lincoln's letter to Horace Greeley. I'm trying to do something that's going to benefit how I see the country runs. If Black folks happen to benefit, fine. Remember, at this point, Republicans needed Black folks to vote, even because they can decide if they're going to make good on their promises to them. They know they're not going to hire them. They know they're not going to give them land. They know they're not going to allow them to have a place in society, and definitely not equality. But they need them to vote. Why do they need them to vote? Because it has been, as it is now, the misconception then that these people were fighting on behalf of Black people when they weren't. But Black people, because they thought that, and when Black people fought themselves in the Civil War, they fought on the side of the Republicans, even though many of the white soldiers would kill the Black soldiers, and that they weren't paid the same, and they still, gave them the worst jobs to do and would not promote them, and all of these different things. They still saw, Black people saw the Republican or the North as their ally, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That whites needed, or Republicans needed, the Blacks to keep Republicans in power. They, to this day, they don't do anything for Black people, Republicans or Democrats. But it's a voting cast that they needed. Hence, they put these amendments in place, which makes sense as to why the 19th Amendment was not part of the Reconstruction Amendments. Women were just completely ignored at this time. And you have to think that's half of the population. And there's more research that needs to go into, if women were not directly addressed during Reconstruction, what was their experience during this time? How did they experience Reconstruction? Similarly or differently than Black people or Mexicans or Native Americans, because history is going on. It's not like the genocide and oppression of Native Americans stopped between 1865 and the Civil Rights Movement. That's 100 years of Native American history that's pretty much ignored. That's 100 years of, well, not 100 years, so we're going to go 65, 75, 85, 95, 1905. That's 50 years of women's history that's ignored until, of course, the 19th Amendment in 1920. So what I'm impressing upon the students this semester is to ask those questions, and we're going to really look and identify the happenings of these particular groups. Okay, major Mexican land has been taken and is now being settled. What is the Mexican experience? Because Blacks built the eastern and southern part of the country through slavery, but Mexicans and Asians built the western part of the country. Now all of it was financed through the slavery that got the country up and going. But the physical labor, that's how that distribution of power works. So there are many histories during Reconstruction that are being missed, that there's a richness of this period that there's so much more research that can be done. And as I'm getting more into reading W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, and also reading Eric Foner's Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution. Whereas in this particular book, um, and others, there's a discussion of more than one reconstruction being 1863 to 1877, but then also the reconstruction of the 1950s and 1960s. Because if you think about it, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act is just a restatement of the Reconstruction Amendments. So you see these two periods mirroring each other. But that's something, those are some questions that I am trying to encourage more people to ask about this period, about these other groups and these other happenings that pop up in 1920. Something was going on in that 50 years prior. Civil rights movement, something was going on, which obviously they cover blacks ad nauseum, but natives, labor. Labor was a huge issue in antebellum America. And it kind of got put on hold during the Civil War. And then when they came with the Freedmen's Bureau was the Bureau of Refugees, poor whites, freedmen, freed slaves, and abandoned land. The labor, poor whites and blacks, in the land. The that was the currency of the day. That was the wealth of that day, was the land. So that was a continuation of antebellum problems trying to get worked out. And you'll see these things actually work all the way through the 1970s with the Philadelphia Plan with Richard Nixon, where he told the white unions, okay, fine, you cannot let blacks in your union if you want to. I can't regulate who you let in where, but you won't get any government contracts. And it was really funny because Richard Nixon was a known racist. But what he felt was, as Lincoln, blacks were inferior and they were incapable of accomplishing things equivalent to white people. But there shouldn't be mechanisms in place to make their life harder for them. And that's where I would dare say most of the white students that I have misunderstand racism. Racism does not mean your life was not hard. That's not what that means. Racism means, or white privilege, more in particular, when they hear white privilege, it doesn't mean that your life was not hard. That means your life was not hard because of your race. All of the hardships that you may have, everybody has those. But there are groups that have hardship because of their race. Just like men. We may have a hard life but it's generally not because of our gender that we have a hard life, which is where misogyny is a huge thing. But many times we're not wired as men to think about our gender, just like whites in particular are not culturally wired to think about their race. And I experienced that when I went to Europe. I never was culturally wired to identify as an American. I know I'm an American, but I would more identify with my community as opposed to my country. That was the first time that I was somewhere and they said, "Well, where are you from?" And I said, "Texas." And they're like, "What is Texas?" I'm like, "Wow, no, I'm from America. I'm from the North American continent." It was just, I'm just not hardwired to do that because I always stayed pretty much nationally. And if I was outside of the country, it was so close to the border of the country, everyone knew where America was. I mean, or the states within America, they were familiar with it. So that's what the goal we're going to set is to really look at the the all of the groups during Reconstruction and what was happening to them during that time that made their situations pop up later. The Native Americans. What was going on during Reconstruction with the Native Americans? What was going on with women during Reconstruction? What was going on with Mexicans during Reconstruction? What was going on with Asians during Reconstruction? Asians have a very long history with the railroads. What was going on with labor? What was going on with class? Because the textbook covers very well how the farmer was being manipulated by Van Buren and the railroads. But they don't really get into how the railroads got sank by John D. Rockefeller because they were trying to set that price like they were doing all of the farmers to John D. Rockefeller, and he built that pipeline and sank the railroads. So those are the multiple things that are going on during Reconstruction. And Du Bois's book is specifically about Black people. And Foner's book is broadly about labor and heavily about Black people. But there's so much more, and there are many books on Reconstruction. I dare not say that those are the only two or the primary authority, but that's what we're going to do is try to really go into Reconstruction and look at the fullness of what happened to everybody immediately after the Civil War.